Hello, my friends. Welcome. My name is Joe. This is the Joe Martino Show. And today we're going to talk about a lot of things. We're going to talk about a technical issue that I had last week. If you listen to the episode on only the audio, you know exactly what I'm talking about. We need to talk about men grieving, and we need to talk a little bit about what does good grief look like. Let's kick it off. This is the Joe Martino Show.
You're listening to the Joe Martino Show, a podcast dealing with all things emotional, relational, and human nature. Joe is a licensed counselor in the state of Michigan, specializing in relationship therapy. He is also the author of the book, The Emotionally Secure Couple. All advice offered in this episode is offered for entertainment and educational purposes only. Enjoy the show.
All right. Hello, my friends. Welcome. Wherever your day is, I hope your day is going well. I hope that you are having a great day. I do need to address a technical issue. Last week, if you listened to episode 303, you know that there were some technical issues, especially in the audio. I think the video on YouTube was fine. So if you listen to just the audio and you want to hear it without the words cut off, go to YouTube and you'll find it there, and you can listen to it with all the words. What happened is I used to use a physical human being editor. I got away from that. I went to a digital editor, AI editor, and that AI editor took a lot of words from me. And so that didn't work. And so we're going to make changes, but last week, episode 303 was the casualty of that. Now, I do want to talk about that episode. Got a lot of emails again on that topic. A lot of people who think I don't understand empathy at all. Some people feel I mislabeled empathy, that I simplified it or overcomplicated it, depending on who you read. I also want to go back to episode 301, where I talked about men grieving. Got a lot of emails about that. Read a few of them last week. I was going to read a few more this week, and I don't know if I will. And this week, we're going to talk about the people who wrote in, who found some virtue there. And I also had someone write in and say that they felt I was not confusing myself, but I was confusing the listener by sending conflicting messages in both podcasts. That if what I said in 301 is true, that what I said in 302 and 303 could not be true. And I think that's because there was some all or nothing thinking going on. So we're going to talk about cognitive distortions a little bit today, and we're going to talk a lot about men grieving, because the woman who made that video has put up a response. And her response is that essentially her husband's fine. Anyone who disagrees with what she did, anyone who doesn't think that her husband is fine, simply doesn't understand humor. They don't have any sense of humor. He's totally fine. Anyone who doesn't think that he would be fine just doesn't have any sense of humor, and that they need to kind of get a grip and get a life. Now, here's the problem. She didn't actually bring her husband on for that video. Now, she brought him on for the video where she mocked him. She brought him on for the video where he said, okay, I'm done. But she didn't bring him on for the video where he's fine. Why? That seems really weird to me. In fact, I don't know what her name is, so I'm going to call her Mary Jane. Mary Jane, I don't believe you. I don't think he is fine. Now, it depends, I guess, on what we mean by fine. Do I think he's probably fine right now? Yeah, I bet you right now he is fine. In other words, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a month, maybe months after you made that video, he probably is fine. But here's the question that I have for you, Mary Jane. Did his trust for you go up or go down that day? Because you missed a chance for intimacy there. And a lot of women wrote into me and said, hey, I appreciate this because I had what it means to be a safe listener not complete. It isn't that they had it wrong. They just didn't have it complete. More than one woman wrote in and she said, hey, I thought being a safe listener was just not being mean. As long as I wasn't mean, I was a safe listener. I had no idea that it was more involved than that. And actually a group of about 6 women, I don't think they know each other, they all wrote in and shared experiences where their husband came home from experiences that the husband had that he found difficult. One went out to coffee with a bunch of friends and felt like his job was minimized. One went golfing. I don't know where that dude lives, but I wish that I was there because I'd love to be outside. And it is not golf weather here right now. But he went golfing and he came back and felt like the things that were important to him were minimized by the guys that he was with. And they all said, I was tempted to just kind of explain away the poor behavior of the other people, not to hurt his feelings or to be less than a good listener, but because I didn't want him to feel bad. And if I could explain it, maybe he wouldn't feel bad. And I could have empathy for what was going on with him. One woman said that. But I wanted to explain it away. That's not empathy, but that's okay, right? And she had empathy, but wanting to explain it away isn't empathy. And so she was stuck there and she felt that way. And so instead they just said, man, that must really be hard. And they sat in it with them. That is empathy, and it's awesome. And that's being a good listener. The fact that Mary Jane came back and she's like, my husband's fine. And if you don't think that, you don't have a sense of humor, that is called not good logic, right? That is denying, dismissing, and diminishing what's going on. And it's just not a good way to approach things. And so as she leans into it, she can do that if she wants. Like, she does not have to admit it. But here's the thing, just get up there and be like, I don't care what you people think. And maybe she doesn't. I'm still going to disagree with you. And this is where I think people get confused maybe with me a little bit, because the people that wrote in were like, especially the one person who was like, your episodes are incongruent. They don't make sense. Which, by the way, I love the word congruent and incongruent. I love how they sound. I love how they roll off the tongue. I like words. And so when they wrote in and they said that, well, that doesn't make sense, because if you're saying she blew it, yeah, I am. And you're saying she can disagree with you. Yes, I am. What I'm not saying is that now I should stop talking to her. I don't know her, so I don't really need to stop talking to her. And this is where people get caught up, because they're like, well, wait, empathy is more than just expressing, hey, I know it, yep. And you're confusing us because you're saying, hey, we should stay in conversation with people we disagree with. Yes, I am. People wrote in about that. I had quite a few people reach out about that. It's funny because on that topic, I had people from both sides. My liberal friends are saying I'm complicit because I'm not using this platform to say that Trump was evil. My conservative friends are saying I'm complicit, or I was complicit, because I didn't use this platform to say Biden was evil. That's not the point of this platform, for me to share my political views with you. If you're my friend, I share my political views with you, and you should share them with me, and we'll sit around and talk. And we probably won't agree on everything, and that'll be okay. And that's the same thing. These wives didn't have to agree with their husbands. But if they want to be safe listeners, they have to create space for him to grieve. And at some point, they get to ask him what appropriate grief looks like. And that is a phrase that we are not comfortable with in modern society. When you start to engage grief, it can be this all-encompassing, all-consuming feeling. And you have to start to ask yourself, what is appropriate grief? What does that look like? How do we engage that? Because Mary Jane, I don't believe you. I've said that now probably 3 times. Because somehow we have to be able to engage grief and grow our intimacy. Somehow we have to be able to engage grief and grow how we love each other. And I don't mean even romantically. Now, in this case, it was a husband and wife. But I mean, how do we love our friends in grief? How do we love our friends who are grieving? How do we love our friends who are grieving things going on in the world versus how do we love friends who are loving things that are going on in the world? And some of it is we have to avoid cognitive distortions. And I've been talking with clients about cognitive distortions here for a while. I feel like it comes up, there's like a cycle to it where they come up a lot. Some of them that come up that are important to consider is all or nothing thinking. And one of the ways to word this is all or nothing thinking is thinking in absolutes such as always, never, or every. And, I never do a good enough job on anything. I always give my best. You never agree with me. You're always this. You're never that. Every time I try to talk to you, you do this. And I see this a lot with couples, but I see it a lot with people too in how they interact with other people. So I want to be clear. I'm not saying that Mary Jane missed out on every opportunity to build intimacy with her husband. I'm saying she missed out on an opportunity in that situation. And if you have no idea what I'm talking about, go back to episode 301, listen to that, watch that, and that'll give you context for today's episode. It's when we start to engage in these all or nothing thinking, or these cognitive distortions, that we lose the opportunity for growth, and we often lose the opportunity for increasing our intimacy. And how that showed itself here with Mary Jane and Frank, I don't know that that's his name either, but we're making names up, is all she had to do was sit there with him. She didn't have to say anything. And this is why I think people get confused, because they hear an episode where someone says, hey, Empathy by itself might not be just the greatest thing ever. It might be a tool, but not the tool. And they lose their minds because they engage in all or nothing thinking. There's a guy that used to live here local. I don't know if he still does, named Kent Dobson. He and I went to the same church together many years ago, and we used to see each other at the YMCA. I haven't seen him there in a while, in part because I haven't been there at the same time that I used to be, and I don't know. I know he did move away. I heard he moved back. I have no idea. You don't care. But he and I were talking one day at the Y because I listened to his podcast, and he said that he thought that the Enneagram was not the only source of knowledge for people to understand themselves. That it was a good source of knowledge, but not the only source. And people lost their minds. They wouldn't even engage the idea that we could misuse the Enneagram, that there could be other sources of information about who you are, about how you operate, about how you interact with the world around you. And they engaged in all or nothing thinking. Oh my goodness, he said that the Enneagram isn't perfect, so therefore it is awful, is what he's saying. And that isn't what he was saying. What he was saying was that it was a source. And when I talk about empathy and I say, hey, it's not the only source, it's not the only thing, it has to be tethered to these bigger things, I'm also not saying you shouldn't just sit there with people, which is why the very first thing we mentioned was sit there with people. Mary Jane could have just sat down next to Frank and said, wow, yeah, I can see that, Frank. That would have meant a lot to him. Part of the problem that we have with empathy is we have taken this all or nothing thinking, this cognitive distortion, and we have applied it to empathy. And it's either all empathy, everything has to be empathy. And this is where emotional reasoning comes into play. And a lot of the people that wrote into me there, that's what they're guilty of, emotional reasoning. I think I mentioned in one of the recent episodes that I read a logic book back in college. And the author actually in the beginning of the book, he says to the reader, or he writes to the reader, be careful because in my research, I have found that when people start to use this, people get mad at them. In other words, people don't want to be confronted with logic. We want to engage in emotional reasoning. And most of the people that wrote in upset about me saying men should be able to grieve, that's what they were doing. They were engaging in emotional reasoning. They didn't like what I said. They felt bad about it, and therefore I'm wrong. And then when they got to the empathy podcast, that was absolutely what was going on. I was wrong because they didn't like what I was saying. Well, not liking what I'm saying doesn't mean that I'm wrong. It just means that you and I disagree, which is why it's so important for us to stay in conversation. And so to be clear, I would be totally okay if Mary Jane put up a post. You know what? I've heard the criticisms of people saying that I was too harsh on my husband, or I missed an opportunity for my husband, and I disagree with you. Okay, awesome. You're entitled to that view. I disagree with you, but you're entitled to that view. Here's why I think you're wrong. Tell me why you think I'm wrong. Most of the time, we don't get that far because we engage in emotional reasoning. I don't like what you're saying, so it's wrong. Or I like what you're saying, so it's right. And you see this all the time in social media. People will repost things that agree with their worldview without actually factually checking them out. And people will then on the other side, I can't believe you posted that. But then you go look at, they do the same thing. Because as humans, we are given to emotional reasoning, which is why we need something a little bit more like logic. And that helps us to grieve well with people. Because we can sit down with the Franks in our world and just be like, yeah, I can see that's a moment for you. Or man, I can see that that was emotional for you. All you have to do is bring up that you can see the emotion that they're experiencing. And you can sit there in that with them for a moment. We'll often get stuck because we try to fix it rather than just sit there. And I'm not advocating that. Like, just sit with your friend that is grieving. Ladies, just sit with your husband that is grieving the passing of time. Husbands, just sit with your wife who's going to pass the grieving of time at some point. Just sit with your friends. You don't have to say anything. You don't have to fix it. What we're trying to do is we're trying to fix it in such a way that we would like the outcome, assuming that our friend wants that, and that's not always the case. Right? Or we use emotional reasoning. I'm uncomfortable here, so I need to shut this down, and I'm going to crack a joke. And we use humor to deflect. That's not good grieving. Just sit there with them. Now, all of the things, and I'm not going to repeat it, but if you want to hear it, go back to episode 303. All of the things still apply. You need to point them to purpose, right? We need to talk about our values at some point. At some point, you have to sit with your friend that is grieving and say, you know what, you've been grieving, what's next? But the danger is that we think the same approach applies every time to all things. Sometimes it's just about sitting there and waiting and living in the discomfort and living in the distress and just moving forward. And unlike Mary Jane, when we miss it, just be like, I missed it. I'm sorry, I missed it. Just recently, my wife and I were teaching a group, and we were talking about something, and I disagree with how she teaches it, and she disagrees with how I teach it. Essentially, it's mirroring. I think you should start with emotion. If it's really apparent, you start with the emotion. If it's not, you can start with facts. And I was talking, and I realized that we actually teach it the same way, or we believe in the same way. We're just using different words. And I said it in such a way that she felt insulted. It's a really easy apology. I did not mean to insult you. I'm sorry. Will you forgive me? It's so simple. And then we move forward. And that's all Mary Jane had to do. All she had to do was say, whoops. And the women who wrote in, that's what they did. They're like, oh man, I didn't realize it. Whoops. And a lot of them, I wrote them back and I was like, hey, I'd encourage you to go to your husband and tell him what you're learning. And tell him, oh, hey, that isn't what I meant to do. This is what I meant to do. That isn't what I thought I was doing. This is what I thought I was doing. And I realize now that that isn't it. That's it. That's all we have to do. It's really easy. I had a back and forth with one person who wrote in, and she said, hey, so I'm a little confused though. What do I do as I'm making space for my husband to grieve? And this is where it gets complicated, because the answer is nothing and yet something. And this is where the cognitive distortions come in, right? Because we tend to think that we can mind read, which we can't. We tend to use all or nothing thinking. And when we do mind reading, what we're doing is we're interpreting things without adequate evidence. And that runs along hand in hand with emotional reasoning. I'm uncomfortable. He's mad, so he must be mad at me. Or maybe he's sad, and he's sad, therefore mad at me. And maybe that's not true at all. But as it runs, one of the things you want to look at is, what does it mean to just sit with your friends, to sit with your loved ones, and then say, okay, what does it look like to move forward? Because as I said earlier, grief can be this all-encompassing, all-consuming feeling, and people want to stop. And there becomes this dangerous moment where we're grieving so much that we stop living. And at some level, what we want to do is we want to encourage our friends to live. We want to encourage our husbands who are grieving life to live. And this is why empathy has to be attached to purpose. Because what does it look like to you for you to live out to purpose, for you to live out your purpose, for you to live out to meaning, for you to live out things that you find meaningful? It doesn't mean that you can't grieve. It doesn't mean that you can't be sad. My wife and I were talking about something recently where I was grieving it. And she said, how are you doing with it now? I said, I just needed time to come to grips with it. And I think I have. Now, of course, one of the dangers in that is that there is this very unclear line where you think you've processed it, and then something else comes up, and now you have to process it some more. And that becomes a run in your life. That becomes a pattern in lives that changes. In other words, the thing that you grieved before and then became good with it, and then something else came up that you had to readjust to, that process might look differently this time, and that's okay as well. And so to Frank, I say, you know what? I really do hope you are okay. I hope you and Mary Jane are okay. I hope that you appreciate her humor, and I hope that she learns to apologize. And maybe she has, and she doesn't want to say it. I don't really care about Mary Jane and Frank that much. I don't know them. But I do care about you, the listener. I want you to come to the place where you can create intimacy by just grieving with someone. It is okay to sit there and grieve. To the person that wrote in and said, well, you're contradicting yourself, I don't really think I am. I think you're committing all or nothing thinking. And you won't respond to that email. So I don't know how to move that conversation forward. Because what I'm saying is there are times where it is appropriate to just sit with someone. And there are times where it's appropriate to sit with someone and say, okay, you've had time to grieve. What does it look like to grow and move forward? Now, there are different things that we grieve. I know someone who lost a sibling, and their spouse said to them, hey, it's been almost a year. Maybe it's time. Like, that's a little, that's not a little. That's just a bad way to handle that. you're on very bad ice right there. And you want to move forward cautiously and gently and kindly. And those are principles that we want to engage. For the people that are upset because I'm not using this to call out your moral position as the high ground, I'm sorry, then maybe this isn't the podcast for you. And I'm okay with that. I'm not going to change this. I'm not telling you not to listen to it. I hope that you do. I want everybody to listen to it. But I'm not going to change how I use this. This place is a place for us to learn all the things that make us human. It's a place for me to hopefully challenge some of the things that we hold dear. It's a place for me to hopefully challenge some of the things that I hold dear. It's a place for me to bring some ideas to you that are hopefully provocative enough that you're chewing on them for days after listening to the episode. That's what this is for me. All right. Hey, listen, I'd love to know what you think. I'm happy for you to write in. If you agree with me or disagree with me, I'm totally okay with that. Write in, let me know. Me disagreeing with you isn't saying that I don't think you should have written in. Me continuing to disagree with you isn't me saying that I don't think you should write in and let me know. Feel free. Of course, writing in you do agree that I get to publish it without using your name unless I get your permission, but I do get to read what you write because I enjoy that, and so do the readers. Thanks so much for listening. We'll catch you next week.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed today's show, please share with a friend. And hey, give us that rating in your podcast store. Until next time, change possible.